They said Dr. Gideon Cross built his house too far from town because he couldn't stand to hear the sound of church bells. He called it solitude. Others called it punishment. The house stood at the edge of the Virginia woods, a tall, grey mansion with shuttered windows and rooms so still they could make a whisper sound like thunder. Inside it lived his only daughter, Maren Lee, a girl who could not feel pain. When she burned her hand on the stove as a child and didn't cry, the doctor said it was a miracle, but by the time she turned 18, he began to call it a curse. And in that house on Black Hollow Road, surrounded by fog and silence, he made it his life's work to fix her, no matter what it cost her to be whole. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to Virginia, 1860, where even the kindest hands can become instruments of horror. The house stood alone at the end of a long, twisting road that the townsfolk rarely travelled. They said the fog on Black Hollow never lifted, even in summer. Some nights, when the moon was thin and cold, a single lamp glowed in one of the upper windows, not bright enough to see by, only enough to remind those who passed that someone still lived there. Caleb had worked that land since he was a boy. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every sigh of the wind that slipped through its shuttered halls. Yet, even he said the Cross house had changed. It wasn't just the rot in the beams or the way the magnolias grew too close to the windows. It was the silence, the kind that seemed to listen back. Dr. Gideon Cross built that house with his own hands 20 years earlier, when he was still a man people spoke kindly of. Back then he'd been known for his skill, the best physician in the county, maybe in all Virginia. But after his wife, Margaret, died of fever, he stopped taking patients. He moved his study upstairs, closed the shutters, and devoted himself to only one case, his daughter's. Maren Lee Cross was unlike any child Caleb had ever seen, pale as porcelain, quiet as snowfall. When she was small, she wandered barefoot through the frost without shivering. Once, she slipped on the steps and split her chin open. Caleb remembered the blood, dark and too much, but she didn't cry. She simply looked at him and asked, "Is this bad?" The doctor had called it a miracle then, told Caleb that God had spared her the burden of pain. But as she grew, that blessing began to look more like a curse. By 18, she could tend fires, carry boiling water, even press her palm to a hot kettle without flinching. Gideon started to keep notes, little leather-bound books filled with her name and the words threshold, reflex, and response. The people in town whispered that the doctor was practicing something unholy, that he'd traded faith for science, and his daughter had become the price. Caleb tried not to believe it. He'd raised her like a sister, protected her when the children called her cursed. But lately, even he found it hard to look at her without feeling a chill. He said the house had grown heavy since Margaret's passing, as if her soul never left, only lingered, pressing against the walls. Sometimes, when the lamps were out, Caleb swore he could still hear her voice upstairs, humming the same hymn she sang before she died. And always there was Maren, pale, calm, and watching. Her eyes followed the light the way a moth might follow a flame, but she never moved toward it. She only asked her father one question, again and again, in that still, soft voice. "Will I ever feel it, Papa?" And every time he answered, "I'll make sure you do." Each morning the Cross house began in silence. No birds sang near it anymore. Even the wind seemed to pass it by. Maren rose before dawn, her hair loose, her face pale and soft beneath the morning light. Caleb would see her crossing the hallway with a bowl of water, her steps soundless on the old wooden floor. She washed her hands as if by ritual, though her fingers bore tiny scars, burns, scrapes, half-healed wounds that never seemed to trouble her. Caleb once asked if they hurt. She looked at her palms for a long time before answering. "Not the way they should," she said quietly. "Sometimes I think the hurt just hides somewhere deeper." Dr. Gideon Cross kept to his study most days, where the smell of medicine and ash hung thick in the air. He wrote for hours, his pen scratching against the paper like an insect trapped in glass. When he called for Maren, she came immediately. He'd take her wrist between his fingers, testing her pulse, pressing a thumb against the blue veins beneath her skin. Still no reaction, he'd mutter, half to himself. Then louder, "Do you feel this, Maren?" She'd shake her head gently. "No, Father. Should I?" He'd sigh, set his instruments aside, and pace the floor. "One day," he'd whisper, "one day your body will learn what your soul refuses." To the townspeople, Maren was a curiosity, a name spoken in hushed tones when the evenings grew long. Some said she was born without nerves, others said her father's sins had hollowed her. Children dared each other to walk past the gate, saying if you stood long enough, you'd see her in the upstairs window, staring down at you without blinking. But Caleb knew her differently. She was gentle, careful, always tending to small, living things. She fed the doves behind the kitchen, stroked their feathers, watched them fly away. Sometimes she'd nick her hand on a thorn bush and simply watch the blood bead on her finger, fascinated, almost tender toward her own wound. "Does it frighten you?" Caleb once asked. She smiled faintly. "No, but it frightens him." By afternoon, Gideon's temper grew worse. The doctor who once healed others now spoke in riddles about thresholds and limitations, about how feeling was the essence of life itself. He accused God of cruelty to make a creature unable to feel his design. That night, as Caleb cleared the dining table, he heard the faint click of locks above. Gideon had begun his experiments again. Maren sat in the study chair, eyes steady, her father's instruments gleaming beside her. He asked, "Are you ready?" She nodded once. "If it helps you, Father." Outside, the fog thickened until the cross house vanished completely from the road. Only the faint glow of one candle visible through the upper window, burning against the dark like a promise no one should have made. Caleb had lived in the cross house so long that its sounds had become his language. He could tell by the rhythm of Dr. Cross's footsteps whether the doctor was angry, hopeful, or lost inside his thoughts again. But it was Maren's silence that spoke the loudest. He would find her in the greenhouse sometimes, sitting among the wilted herbs and dust-covered glass jars. She liked that room best. The light there was soft, filtered through grime and ivy. Sometimes she pressed her palm against the glass, holding it there until condensation gathered and ran down her fingers like sweat. One morning, Caleb entered quietly and saw her holding a sewing pin to her arm. Not stabbing, only testing. She pricked the skin, drew a bead of blood, and watched it rise. Then she pressed her thumb against it and smiled faintly, as if admiring a flower. "Miss Maren," he said softly. She startled, the pin falling. "I didn't feel it," she whispered, eyes wide but calm. "But I saw it happen." "Isn't that strange?" Caleb didn't answer. He knelt, picked up the pin, and noticed faint red dots tracing up her wrist, a quiet constellation of invisible pain. "Your father wouldn't want you doing this," he said. She looked at him, unblinking. "He wants me to feel, doesn't he? Maybe I can help him find it." He didn't understand then, but something about the way she said find it chilled him. Later that evening, he brought her tea to the parlour. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and medicine. She was reading one of her father's books, anatomy sketches and handwritten notes filling the margins. "Does it hurt to feel?" she asked suddenly, not looking up. "Sometimes," he said. "And people cry? Sometimes that helps." She turned a page, eyes tracing the diagrams. "Then I envy you," she murmured. From that night on, Caleb began to notice little changes. The way she'd linger by the fire longer than before. The way her sleeves stayed rolled up, her skin raw from scrubbing. And always, that soft hum under her breath, the same melody Margaret used to sing when the fever took her. One afternoon, as rain pounded the roof, Caleb caught her outside beneath the downpour, her arms outstretched. Mud soaked her gown, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She looked up into the storm, eyes closed, whispering something he couldn't hear. He called out, but she didn't answer. When he finally pulled her inside, dripping and pale, she only said, "I thought maybe the cold would hurt." Her voice trembled for the first time he could remember, but not from fear, from hope. And that, more than anything, frightened him. Dr. Gideon Cross began calling them sessions. never tests, never experiments. In his mind, those words belonged to science. What he did, he said, belonged to love. The study smelled of iron and candle smoke. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out even the faintest glow from the fields below. On the long table lay his instruments, polished, gleaming, each one arranged with the precision of prayer. Maren sat quietly in the chair beside it, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Caleb stood in the hall, close enough to hear, but not enough to be seen. He always told himself he shouldn't listen, but every time he tried to walk away, the sound of her voice kept him there. Gideon began with questions, always the same ones. "Do you feel this?" "No, Father." "And this?" A pause. "No." Sometimes there was the faint hiss of flame, the low click of metal meeting skin. Gideon spoke calmly, like a teacher at a lesson. And Maren's replies were calm too, steady, unbroken. That frightened Caleb more than any scream could. Afterward, Gideon would pace the floor, muttering his notes aloud. No reaction, no reflex, no tremor. The threshold remains absolute. His voice trembled between awe and despair. When it was over, Maren would return to her room and wash her hands in cold water until her skin turned white. Caleb once brought her a cloth and asked if she was angry with him for not stopping it. She looked at him softly and said, "He's trying to find what I've lost." Maybe we both are. Downstairs, Gideon drank from his study glass until the lamplight swam. He spoke to the portrait of his late wife, Margaret, in her pale blue dress, her painted eyes forever kind. "You would understand," he whispered. "She's trapped in a body that doesn't answer to God. I can fix her, Maggie. I can give her back her soul." One night, the sound changed. Caleb heard not the quiet rhythm of their usual sessions, but a sharp cry, brief, cut short. He rushed to the door, but it was bolted. Gideon shouted for him to stay back. When the door finally opened, the doctor's face was streaked with sweat. "She moved," Gideon whispered, half in wonder, half in terror. Her hand twitched. "It's a beginning." Behind him, Maren sat still as ever, her gaze unfocused. Caleb saw the mark on her wrist, faint but real. She traced it with her finger as if memorizing the shape of what pain should feel like. Then she looked up at her father and smiled faintly. "I think I almost felt it," she said. And Gideon, his eyes wet, whispered back, "Then we're getting close, my darling." The next morning, the doctor left early, his carriage wheels crunching over the frozen mud. He was gone before sunrise, headed toward Richmond to retrieve new instruments. Caleb was told to keep the house quiet and the fires low. Maren stayed in her room, her window open to the cold air, staring out at the grey valley below. By afternoon, the house felt hollow. Caleb moved through it slowly, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, folding linens that were already folded, anything to keep from hearing the echoes of the night before. He entered the study to collect the doctor's glassware and noticed the journal, the small brown book Gideon always kept locked in the drawer. Now it lay open on the desk, as if waiting. Caleb hesitated. He told himself it wasn't his place, but the ink was still wet, and something in him needed to know. The handwriting began like a doctor's record, dates, temperature notes, anatomical observations. Then it changed. The lines grew frantic, uneven, written with a hand that had stopped belonging to science. Maren's nerve endings remain inert. The absence of pain persists. I have tested temperature, incision, and pressure. Nothing. God, why nothing? A few pages later, if pain is the proof of life, then she is unproven. I must force the body to remember, and farther down, written with trembling strokes. Sometimes she smiles during the trials. I do not know if it is defiance or longing. I think she wants to feel it too. Caleb's breath caught. The last page was worse. A rough sketch of a hand, slender and pale, with notations along each joint. At the bottom was a single line. When she bleeds but does not cry, something divine watches. He closed the book quickly, his stomach tight. For the first time he saw the madness that had crept into the man he'd once trusted. Later, Maren found him in the hall. She was barefoot again, her gown too thin for the cold. "He's going to help me soon," she said softly, her eyes bright in the dim light. "He said he found the answer in a dream." Caleb wanted to tell her what he'd read, but her expression stopped him, the fragile hope of a child who still believed her father's love could save her. That night, thunder rolled across the hills. The house shuddered under the weight of the storm. Caleb lay awake, the sound of rain mingling with the faint clink of metal above. He knew the doctor had returned. He always worked best when the world was asleep. And in that storm, a flash of lightning lit the upstairs window. For a moment, Caleb saw two figures, one standing, one seated, framed in the glass. The candlelight flickered once, then vanished. The next morning, a faint smell of singed cloth lingered in the hall. By early spring, the fog that blanketed Black Hollow thinned only enough to reveal how sickly the earth beneath had become. The grass was pale, and the roses Margaret once planted grew in wild, thorny clusters along the garden wall. Maren spent her mornings there, kneeling in the dirt, humming softly as she pruned the dead stems. Caleb watched from a distance. She wore no gloves, never did. The thorns tore her skin, drawing thin, bright lines of red that she examined like someone reading scripture. She never winced, never pulled away. He approached quietly, afraid to startle her. "You'll ruin your hands, Miss Maren," he said. She smiled faintly without looking up. They were never perfect to begin with. He knelt beside her. The smell of wet earth and wilted petals clung to the air. For a long while they worked in silence. Then she said, "I used to dream of my mother tending these. She said pain was part of their beauty. The thorns make the blossoms honest." Caleb didn't know how to answer. He saw the scratches on her arms, the way she pressed her palms into the soil as if she wanted to feel the heartbeat of the earth itself. Later that afternoon, Dr. Cross came to the garden. His coat was buttoned to the throat, his hair uncombed, eyes bright with sleeplessness. He watched her from the steps. "Maren," he said sharply, "inside. The air's too damp for you." She rose obediently, brushing the dirt from her dress. But as she passed him, he caught her wrist and stared at the scratches. "You did this to yourself?" "I was pruning," she said calmly. He studied the blood, small, fragile lines across her skin. For a moment his face softened. Then, just as quickly, the softness vanished. "If this is what it takes to reach you," he muttered, almost to himself, "then so be it." That evening, the house was quiet. Maren sat by the window, her hands freshly bandaged. Gideon walked the halls with a restlessness that made the floorboards groan. Caleb, in the kitchen below, could hear his footsteps tracing the same pattern, study, parlour, then back again. When he passed her door hours later, he paused. Through the crack of light beneath it, he saw her standing before the mirror, unwrapping the cloth from her fingers. She touched one of the deeper cuts, pressing until blood welled. She watched it bead and slide down her wrist, her reflection trembling in the candlelight. Then, very quietly, she whispered, "Hello." Caleb stepped back, his heart pounding. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether she was talking to herself or to the thing her father was trying to wake inside her. Word travels fast in a small town, even when it's carried only in whispers. By late March, the talk around Black Hollow had changed from pity to unease. Some said Dr. Cross was performing unnatural studies. Others said his daughter was not human at all, that she was a hollow girl God had forgotten to finish. When a carriage arrived from Richmond one afternoon, Caleb thought perhaps Gideon's reputation had finally caught up with him. Out stepped a man in a dark overcoat, carrying a leather bag worn smooth from years of travel. Dr. Harold Fenwick, once a colleague of Gideon's, now a cautious stranger. The air in the Cross house tightened when he entered. Gideon greeted him warmly, almost desperately. "It's good to see a scientific mind again," he said, though his smile looked brittle. Fenwick wasted little time on pleasantries. "There are rumours," he said, "about your daughter, about your work here. I came to see the truth for myself." Gideon led him upstairs, pride flickering in his eyes. "You'll see a marvel, Not a monstrosity, he said. A medical phenomenon that could change everything we know about the human body. Maren sat by the fire, calm as always. Fenwick introduced himself with polite curiosity. "Your father tells me you feel no pain," he said. She nodded once. "Not the kind you mean." He glanced at her bandaged hands, then at the doctor. "And you've tested this?" Gideon's posture stiffened. With care. With precision. Always for her benefit, Fenwick hesitated, then asked, "May I?" He took her wrist gently and pressed the tip of a pen against her skin until it left a white mark. She didn't move. He pressed harder. The skin broke, a bead of blood rose, and still, she sat perfectly still. The other doctor stepped back, visibly shaken. "This isn't medicine, Gideon," he whispered. "This is torment disguised as study." Gideon's eyes flashed. "You don't understand. I'm giving her what nature denied, the ability to feel. Without pain, there is no empathy, no growth, no soul. She's incomplete," Maren's voice interrupted, soft but steady. "Maybe I was never meant to be complete." Fenwick turned toward her, pity shadowing his face. "You're not the one who's broken, child," he said quietly. Then to Gideon, "End this, before you lose her completely." But Gideon only smiled, a hollow, terrible smile. "I've already come too far." That night, after the visitor left, Maren stood in the hall, listening to her father pacing in his study. His voice rose and fell like a man praying or cursing. Caleb, cleaning downstairs, caught only fragments through the walls. "Faithless fools, proof of the divine. She will feel. She must." When the house finally fell silent, Maren went to her room and sat by the window. Outside, the fog rolled in thick and slow. She whispered something into it, something that sounded like a plea or perhaps a warning, and somewhere in the distance, thunder answered her. The rain returned the next evening, soft and steady against the windows, washing the Cross house in a grey, rhythmic silence. Caleb had taken to closing the shutters himself before nightfall, an old habit from when Margaret was alive. She had always hated the sound of wind in the hallways. Now it only reminded him how long she'd been gone. Dr. Cross had locked himself in the study again, muttering about new methods, chemical stimulation, and the necessity of divine trial. Maren sat by the parlour fire, her face half lit, the skin of her hands still marked from the thorns. Caleb knew she was trying not to think. He'd seen that look before, the quiet that comes before a storm breaks inside a person. He went to fetch wood from the cellar and found the old trunk still sitting near the furnace. Margaret's trunk. No one had touched it since her death. Dust covered the lid like a second skin. On impulse, he brushed it clean, and something loosened beneath the brass latch, a folded envelope tucked into the seam. It was sealed, brittle with age, the wax faintly marked with the Cross family crest. The handwriting on the front was delicate, unmistakable. To Gideon. He should have left it there. But curiosity and dread are siblings, and both were whispering in his ear. The letter was dated 3 weeks before Margaret died. The ink had bled in places, but the words were still clear. "If you find this, it means you've chosen your work over us. Gideon, please, let her be what she is. I know you believe her body is wrong, but she was born of mine, and no creation from love is a mistake. Don't let the pursuit of feeling destroy the only heart that still beats for you. Remember what pain is for. It keeps us human." Caleb folded it slowly, his hands trembling. He thought of Maren's calm eyes, the doctor's shaking ones, of how love in this house had turned itself into something unrecognizable. That night, he slipped the letter into his pocket. He meant to show it to Maren, but the courage never came. When he brought her tea before bed, she was writing by candlelight, her journal filled with small, neat sentences. He caught a glimpse of one as she turned the page. "If pain is proof of the soul, does that mean I have none?" He froze. She looked up at him then, those pale eyes seeming to glow from within. "You shouldn't be afraid of me, Caleb," she said gently. "He's the one trying to make me feel alive." Downstairs, Gideon's voice rose suddenly in a fit of rage. The smell of burning drifted through the vents. When Caleb crept to the study door, he saw the doctor standing over the hearth, watching something blacken in the fire. The Bible. Margaret's Bible. And in that quiet orange glow, Gideon whispered, "Faith is for those who need pain to believe. I've found another way." The storm passed, but its silence lingered, that deep, heavy quiet that settles after lightning burns itself out. For 3 days the house seemed suspended between breath and stillness. Gideon barely spoke. He ate little, slept less. When he did appear, it was often behind Maren's shoulder, his gaze fixed on her face as if waiting for something to change. One afternoon, Maren drifted into the parlor where her mother's piano sat, untouched since the funeral. Dust had gathered along the keys like thin grey lace. She traced her fingers across them, pressing softly until a note broke through the silence. It was off-key, but beautiful in its loneliness. Caleb, cleaning the floor nearby, froze at the sound. Maren didn't look up. She played again, slower this time. A lullaby. Margaret's song. "I used to sit beside her when she played," Maren said quietly. She said music was another way to feel. She struck a higher key, then stopped, watching her reflection shimmer faintly in the piano's polished wood. "Sometimes I think she's still here," she whispered, "in this glass, in the sound." Gideon appeared in the doorway. His voice startled them both. "Your mother is gone," he said sharply. "Stop reaching for ghosts." "I'm not," Maren said. "I'm reaching for her warmth." He crossed the room, his tone softening as he knelt beside her. "You'll have it soon enough, my darling. I'll bring it back to you." Caleb felt a cold weight in his stomach. The way the doctor said it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a promise. Later that night, Maren returned to the parlor. The candles had burned low, their wax pooling like tears. She sat before the mirror above the piano, staring into it. Caleb, passing by, paused in the doorway. She didn't notice him. In the reflection, her face looked pale and unfamiliar, her eyes almost too calm. She touched her cheek, pinched it lightly, then pressed her finger against her own throat where her pulse should have throbbed. Nothing. Behind her, Gideon appeared in the reflection. He had moved silently, watching her from the doorway. His hand rested briefly on her shoulder, his eyes hollow. "You see," he murmured, "you are perfect. Even your reflection doesn't know where you end and the world begins." She looked at him in the mirror. "Is that why you love me, Father?" He didn't answer, only smiled, brittle and glassy. Caleb turned away before she saw him watching. But the sound of the piano followed him up the stairs, a slow, uneven melody, as if Maren was trying to make the notes hurt, and in the parlor below, 2 reflections seemed to flicker in the candlelight. One belonging to the girl who couldn't feel pain, and the other to the man trying to teach her how. Caleb could no longer tell what frightened him more, the house or the people left inside it. Dr. Cross moved through the halls like a ghost that refused to rest. His steps came at odd hours, pacing from study to laboratory, from laboratory to his daughter's door. Some nights, Caleb heard him whispering Margaret's name through the walls. Other nights, it was Maren's, always soft, always like a prayer turned confession. Maren had changed too. Her quiet had taken on a new edge, not peace, but distance. She wandered through the house barefoot, her eyes unfocused, humming a slow tune that never seemed to end. Once, when Caleb asked what she was humming, she said, "It's Mother's song. It helps me remember that feeling is real, even if it isn't mine." The air between them was thick with what couldn't be said. One evening, while Caleb cleaned the parlor, he found the journal again. Gideon had left it open this time, almost carelessly. The last entry chilled him. The mind must be taught what the flesh cannot. Repetition, induction, intensity. Pain is not cruelty. It is awakening. That night, the experiments grew longer. Caleb could hear the faint hum of the generator Gideon had built, the sound of a current running through wire and bone. Maren's voice floated through the door, low and steady. "Still nothing, Father. Perhaps the pain is yours, not mine." A crash followed, glass shattering, a chair overturned. Then, silence. When Caleb dared to enter, the room reeked of burnt oil. Gideon was kneeling on the floor, his hands trembling, staring at a small scorch mark on Maren's arm. His face was wet with tears. "She laughed," he whispered, dazed. "Do you understand?" She laughed. "It means the body remembers." Maren stood nearby, her dress torn, her expression distant. "I didn't laugh because it hurt," she said softly. "I laughed because you wanted it to." Caleb stepped between them before Gideon could speak. "You've done enough, sir." Gideon rose, his face twisting with fury. "You know nothing of science, boy. Of love. She's my child, my creation. I will make her whole." Later, after Gideon stormed off to his study, Maren found Caleb in the corridor. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He thinks I'm broken." "Maybe he's right." "You're not," Caleb said quickly. She looked at him then, really looked, the candlelight catching in her eyes. "If I'm not broken," she said, "then he is, and I think he's trying to mend himself through me." She turned and walked away before he could answer, her shadow stretching long across the wall, fragile, unsteady, as though the light itself couldn't decide whether to hold on to her or let her go. And in that moment, Caleb realized that love could look a lot like cruelty when it refused to let go of what was already lost. It happened on a night that smelled of rain and metal, the kind of storm where thunder hides inside the hills and waits to strike twice. Caleb had gone to bed early, hoping the quiet might last. It never did in that house. A sudden crash woke him, the sound of glass shattering upstairs, followed by a low hum that wasn't thunder. The generator. He ran toward the study. Light bled beneath the door, flickering like fireflies in a jar. He heard Gideon's voice inside, calm, almost tender. "Tell me when you feel it, Maren." "I don't," she said softly. "Not yet." "Then we'll go higher." There was a sharp crack, electricity snapping through the air. Caleb pushed against the door, but it was bolted. He pounded until his fists stung. "Doctor, please." No answer, only Gideon's breath, ragged and fevered. Then another sound, laughter, high, bright, wrong. When the door finally opened, the air smelled of ozone and burning cloth. Gideon stood there, his face pale and wet, his hair wild. Behind him, the table was overturned, wires scattered, the lamp shattered on the floor. "She laughed," he whispered, trembling. "Do you hear me, Caleb?" She laughed. It means she felt something. Maren sat against the wall, her dress scorched near the hem, her skin glistening with sweat. Her eyes were wide but unfocused. She looked serene. Caleb knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "Miss Maren, can you hear me?" She turned to him, smiling faintly. "I heard him, Caleb. He sounded so happy. You need rest." "I don't feel tired." She reached up and touched his cheek with trembling fingers. "You're warm." I can tell Gideon fell to his knees beside them. "Don't you see," he said, clutching Caleb's arm. "Pain isn't just in the body, it's in recognition. She's learning through you, through me, through madness," Caleb muttered. The doctor's expression changed. The warmth curdled into fury. "You will not speak of what you don't understand." He rose, shaking, pointing toward the door. "Get out." Both of you, Caleb helped Maren to her feet. Her steps were unsteady, but she didn't seem hurt. Only lighter somehow. She turned back once at the threshold. "Father," she said, "if I cry one day, will you stop?" He didn't answer. He just stared at her as if she had spoken in a language only he could hear. That night, the generator went dark. The next morning, a burn mark shaped like a hand remained on the study wall. Gideon called it a sign. Caleb called it what it was, a warning. After the accident, the house grew quieter, but not in the way that meant peace. It was the stillness that follows a scream too loud to fade. The doctor stopped leaving his study, and Maren stopped asking to go outside. She drifted from room to room like a figure half-remembered from a dream. Caleb noticed it first, the smile. It wasn't constant, just wrong when it came. Before, her expressions were small, uncertain things, soft flickers that vanished as soon as they appeared. Now her smile stayed too long, held just past the point of comfort. He found her in the parlour one morning, standing before the window, sunlight cutting through the fog. "You're awake early," he said. She turned, that strange smile tugging at her lips. "The light feels sharp today," she said. "I think that's what pain must feel like, a kind of brightness." He hesitated. "Does it hurt?" She looked thoughtful. "No, but it feels close, like I'm standing at the edge of something." As she moved past him, he saw the marks on her arms, tiny burns, faint scratches, a line of fresh red along her wrist. "Miss Maren," he whispered, "what happened?" "I'm testing," she said simply. "Father says I might be learning." Caleb caught her wrist gently. "You don't have to listen to him anymore." Her eyes lifted to his, steady and unblinking. "Then, who should I listen to, Caleb? The world that doesn't believe I exist, or the man who's trying to make sure I do?" He let her go. There was nothing left to say that didn't sound like a lie. That evening, Gideon called Caleb into the study. The doctor was surrounded by papers, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "She's close," he said. "Something inside her is changing. I can feel it. When she smiled earlier, it reminded me of her mother." Caleb said nothing. He only noticed the shaking in the doctor's hands. Later that night, Maren appeared at Caleb's door. Her hair was loose, her face pale as moonlight. "Do you think pain makes people real?" she asked. He hesitated. "It makes them fragile." "Then maybe fragility is what I'm missing." She turned her arm over and pressed the tip of a candle flame to her skin. Caleb lunged forward, blowing it out, but she didn't flinch. She looked at him with something like wonder. "I thought I saw it," she whispered. "For a moment, I almost felt the world." Her voice trembled, but her smile didn't fade. It wasn't joy, it wasn't cruelty. It was something far more terrifying: acceptance. When she left, the faint smell of burnt wax lingered. Caleb sat in the dark, staring at the floor where a drop of wax had hardened. It looked like a tear. The next morning, Gideon told him proudly, "She's beginning to feel." Caleb didn't correct him. He only prayed that what Maren was learning wasn't pain, but pleasure in its absence. The first dream came after 3 nights without sleep. Maren had taken to lying awake until dawn, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if waiting for something to fall through it. Caleb sometimes heard her pacing, the soft creak of the floorboards following her from room to room. Then one morning he found her seated in the parlour, the candles still burning low. She looked exhausted but calm. "I saw her," she said quietly. "Who?" "My mother." Her voice was soft, like she was afraid the name itself might disappear. She was standing in the garden. The thorns were blooming again, and the air smelled like rain. I went to her, and she didn't say my name. She just smiled and said, "Pain is proof that you're still alive." Caleb felt a shiver crawl through him. It was only a dream. Maren turned to the window. Then why did it feel more real than this? From the hall came the sound of Gideon's boots against the floorboards. He'd been drinking again, Caleb could tell by the heavy, deliberate steps. He entered the room, his hair unkempt, his eyes bright with feverish conviction. "You're pale, my darling," he said. "Are you in pain?" Maren hesitated. "Maybe. I don't know what it's called." Gideon grinned. "That's good. That's progress." He turned to Caleb. "Fetch me the vial from my study." Caleb hesitated. "What for?" "An experiment," Gideon snapped. "She says she feels something, then we'll measure it properly." Caleb didn't move. "She's tired, sir." Gideon's gaze hardened. "Go." But before Caleb could protest again, Maren's hand found his. "It's all right," she whispered. "If it helps him believe, maybe it will help me too." The doctor's study smelled of old chemicals and decay. Caleb found the vial, a thin glass bottle labelled ether, and brought it back reluctantly. Gideon poured a few drops onto a cloth, pressing it near Maren's face. She didn't resist, didn't blink. Her head tilted slightly, and for a moment her expression softened into something almost peaceful. Then she spoke, her voice distant, dreamlike. "Mother's in the fire, Father." Gideon froze. "What?" "She says you made the fire, and now it's coming for you." The doctor's hand shook. "Nonsense." Just the ether talking, Caleb saw the sweat break across his brow, the flicker of fear behind his eyes. For a man of science, Gideon was beginning to sound like a believer. When Maren finally stirred, her first words were a whisper. She said, "I'll feel everything at once, and when I do, I won't be me anymore." Caleb looked to Gideon, but the doctor only smiled faintly, whispering, "Then maybe that's what it takes to make you whole." That night, when Caleb checked her room, Maren was already asleep again. A thin trail of soot lay across her windowsill, as if something had brushed past from the garden below. And for the first time, Caleb locked his door. For days, the house had been filled with the sound of Gideon's pacing, the steady, uneven rhythm of a man walking himself into madness. The air inside grew so heavy that even breathing felt like a trespass. Caleb knew Maren needed to get out. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, he asked her to come with him to the river. She hesitated, glancing toward her father's study, where the lamplight burned like a fever through the cracks in the door. "He'll notice," she murmured. "He already notices too much," Caleb said. "Come, just for a while." The path down to the water was overgrown, the air damp with the smell of moss and rain. The river wound through the hollow like a dark vein, slow and silent. When they reached it, Maren slipped off her shoes and stepped into the shallows. The cold water curled around her ankles, but she didn't flinch. Caleb watched her carefully. The reflection of the fading sky painted her face in pale gold and shadow. "What do you feel?" he asked. She tilted her head, considering. "Nothing sharp. Just wait. Maybe that's what pain is, the world pressing back." He smiled sadly. "That's as close to peace as anyone gets." She looked at him then, truly looked, her eyes softening for the first time in weeks. "You feel too much, Caleb. Maybe you could give some of it to me." He didn't answer. The sound of the water and the wind filled the silence between them, and for a brief moment, the world felt balanced. Two people standing in the middle of everything broken, pretending it wasn't. When they returned, the house loomed darker than before. The upstairs light glowed faintly, Gideon's study. Caleb's stomach tightened. "Go to your room," he whispered. "I'll tell him you were resting." But Maren shook her head. "He already knows." She was right. Gideon was standing in the hall when they entered, his expression unreadable. "Out walking?" he asked. Caleb started to answer, but the doctor's voice cut through him. "You took her to the river." "Yes, sir," Caleb said carefully. "She needed air." Gideon's gaze turned to Maren. "And did the water hurt you?" "No, Father," she said softly. "It was beautiful." His face twisted, not in anger, but something worse, disappointment. "Then it taught you nothing." He turned to Caleb. "You'll come to me tomorrow." "We'll discuss your duties." When he walked away, the sound of his boots echoed through the corridor like a closing door. Maren's eyes lingered on the staircase. "He's not angry that I went," she said quietly. "He's angry that I came back unchanged." Outside, the fog began to roll back in from the river, thick and white, as if it meant to follow her home. Dr. Gideon Cross had always believed himself to be a man of restraint. But restraint is only another word for control, and control is a fragile thing when love begins to rot. After the river, something in him cracked. The thought of Maren walking beside Caleb, laughing by the water, haunted him like a fever. He told himself it wasn't jealousy, only fear that Caleb's ignorance would undo years of careful work. But when he looked at his daughter now, he didn't see the child he'd sworn to heal. He saw rebellion, distance, contamination. That night, Caleb was summoned to the study. The air smelled of brandy and candle wax. Gideon stood by the desk, his eyes cold and clear. "You've overstepped," he said simply. "I only wanted her to breathe air that wasn't full of smoke," Caleb replied. Gideon's hand tightened around his glass. You think I don't give her air? You think I keep her prisoner? I think you've forgotten what she is, Caleb said softly. She's not a case, sir. She's your daughter. The glass shattered against the wall before he finished speaking. You don't understand, Gideon shouted. She's the proof. Do you think I torture her? I'm trying to save her soul. Caleb didn't move. His voice shook, but he didn't lower it. And what about yours? The silence that followed was sharper than the noise that came before it. Gideon's expression hardened into something hollow. You'll leave this house at first light, he said, but before you do, you'll learn what it means to interfere. He struck Caleb once, open-handed, hard enough to send him staggering. The second blow came with the back of his hand. Then he turned away, his shoulders trembling, ashamed and unashamed at once. Maren appeared in the doorway. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes stopped her father mid-breath. Go to your room, he ordered. She didn't move. If you hurt him again, she said quietly, I'll never let you fix me. The words hit him like a blade. For a moment he looked smaller, less doctor, more man. You don't mean that, he whispered. But she did. Caleb could see it in the way her hands trembled, not from fear, but from control, the kind she'd learned by watching him. Gideon turned away, muttering something under his breath, something about sin, about temptation, about how the devil never comes as a stranger. He left the room without looking back. Caleb tasted blood and regret on his tongue. Maren knelt beside him, dabbing at the bruise on his cheek with her sleeve. He thinks he's saving me, she murmured, but maybe he's the one who doesn't feel anything anymore. Caleb looked into her eyes and saw something there he hadn't before, pity, and beneath it a quiet, dangerous resolve. The morning after the confrontation, the Cross house was steeped in a silence that felt deliberate, like the calm a storm holds before deciding which tree to strike first. Caleb's cheek was still swollen, but he stayed. He couldn't bring himself to leave Maren alone with her father. Every instinct told him something was unraveling, and when Gideon began locking the study from the inside, that feeling only grew heavier. For 3 days, the doctor barely emerged. Caleb heard movement behind the door at odd hours, hammering, glass clinking, the soft whir of the generator being repaired. Once, when he passed, Gideon's voice drifted through the wood, low and urgent. Pain is truth. Pain is life. Without it, she is nothing. Then, one evening, the lock turned and Gideon stepped out. He was clean-shaven, dressed neatly, the wildness in his eyes hidden behind a terrible calm. Maren, he said, it's time. She didn't ask what for. She only nodded, as if she'd been waiting for the words. Caleb tried to follow them into the study, but Gideon stopped him. Not you. This is between father and daughter. The door closed. The bolt slid. From inside came the faint sound of Maren's voice, steady, almost soothing. What are you going to do, father? I'm going to give you what you've always wanted, he replied. You'll feel, my darling. You'll finally feel. Caleb pressed his ear to the door. A soft hum began, the generator again, followed by the smell of heated metal. Then came Gideon's voice, trembling, prayer-like. Pain redeems. Pain awakens. Forgive me. Maren's voice followed, quieter. I forgive you, father. Then a sharp crack. The hum grew louder, electric and alive. Caleb slammed his shoulder into the door until it splintered. The sight inside froze him. Gideon stood behind Maren, his hands gripping her shoulders, wires trailing from the generator to the cuffs around her wrists. A faint current danced along the metal, not enough to kill, but enough to burn. Maren's face was calm, her lips parted as if in wonder. Stop! Caleb shouted. Gideon looked at him, startled, as if waking from a trance. She smiled, he whispered. She smiled because she felt it. Caleb rushed forward, ripping the wires free. Gideon struck him across the jaw, but Caleb didn't stop. He tore the cords away and caught Maren as she slumped forward. Her skin was pale, her pulse faint but there. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed. "I felt it," she whispered. "It hurt, and it was beautiful." Gideon sank to his knees, trembling. "Do you see, Caleb? She's alive now." But Caleb didn't answer. He only looked at the faint burn marks on her wrists, thin, perfect circles, and realized something had ended in that room. Not just trust, not just reason, but the last fragile thread holding the Cross family together. The morning after the experiment, Black Hollow seemed to exhale. The air was damp, heavy, and waiting. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat by the window through the night, watching the road that led to town. He knew someone would come eventually. Rumors had been growing like vines, fed by servants who'd fled and whispers carried by traders passing through. By noon, a horse's hooves broke the stillness. A carriage appeared through the fog, dark blue with the county seal on its side. Two men climbed down, Sheriff Amos Clay and a deputy. Both wore the wary expressions of men who already knew they'd find something they didn't want to see. Gideon met them on the porch, his coat buttoned, his manner composed. "Gentlemen," he said with forced civility, "what brings the law to my door?" The sheriff removed his hat. "Dr. Cross, we've had concerns. Folks say strange noises come from this house, lights at all hours." A young lady screaming Gideon smiled thinly. "You mean my daughter?" "She's ill. These walls carry sound oddly in bad weather." The deputy shifted uneasily. "You mind if we have a look, sir?" For a moment Gideon's expression cracked, a flicker of panic quickly buried beneath pride. "You may look anywhere," he said, "but be careful not to frighten her." "She's delicate." Caleb stood at the top of the stairs, his fists clenched. When the sheriff's eyes met his, something passed between them, a silent plea. They moved through the house slowly, their boots echoing on the wood. The parlor, the kitchen, the cellar, nothing out of place. Then Amos said, "We'll check upstairs." Gideon hesitated. "That won't be necessary." "Beg pardon, Doctor," the sheriff said, "but it's best if we see for ourselves." They reached the study. The door was half open. Inside, the generator still smelled faintly of burnt oil, the air sharp and metallic. Maren sat by the window, her face turned toward the light. Her wrists were wrapped in fresh cloth. "Miss Cross," Amos said gently. She looked at him, eyes distant but kind. "Are you here to see if I'm alive?" The question unsettled everyone. Gideon's jaw tightened. "She's recovering. The light fatigues her." Caleb stepped forward. "She needs to leave this house." Gideon turned on him, voice low and trembling. "You will not speak for her." The sheriff studied them both, then tipped his hat. "I don't see a crime here, Doctor," he said slowly, "but I see something worse. You be careful with that girl. The Lord don't favor those who test his patience." When the carriage rolled away, Gideon's calm shattered. He turned to Caleb, his voice shaking with rage. "You brought them here. You want to take her from me." Maren rose quietly. "No one needs to take me, Father." "I think I've already left," and though she stood right there in front of him, something in her eyes made it true. The night after the sheriff's visit, a stillness fell over the Cross house that felt unnatural, like breath held too long. The tension that had lived inside those walls for months finally snapped, but not into peace, into something far quieter, far stranger. Caleb found Maren sitting by the fireplace, staring at the dying embers. The orange light flickered across her face, casting her in alternating halves, one alive, one hollow. "You should rest," he said softly. "I don't sleep much anymore," she replied. "It hurts when I close my eyes." He frowned. "Hurts?" She nodded slowly, her tone almost curious. "There's a sound inside my head now. Like thunder in a box. I think it's my heartbeat." Caleb knelt beside her. "That's normal. It means you're alive." She looked at him, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "I didn't used to notice it." "Maybe he was right, Caleb. Maybe I'm beginning to feel, after all." Her voice carried neither pride nor fear, only quiet wonder. Later, he brought her tea, but she didn't drink it. She was touching her fingers to the flame of a candle, slowly, deliberately. Her skin reddened, blistering in places. She didn't flinch. "Maren!" he hissed, grabbing her hand and blowing out the candle. She looked at him with calm eyes. "It hurts," she whispered. "I can tell because I want to stop, but I don't." He stared at her, unable to speak. She withdrew her hand and smiled faintly. "I think that's what it means to be human. Wanting something to end, but doing it anyway." From the stairwell came a sound, a soft creak. Gideon stood in the shadows, watching them. His expression was unreadable, a mix of awe and terror. "You see," he said quietly, "it's happening. The body remembers." "Leave her alone," Caleb snapped. "She's not your experiment." But Gideon only stepped closer, eyes glistening. "You don't understand, boy." "This is Grace. She's awakening to the truth." Maren turned toward her father. "It hurts, Father," she said softly, "but it's beautiful." He sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Then it's worth it. Every moment, every sin. You're whole now, my child." Caleb pulled her back. "She's not whole. She's breaking." Gideon's gaze flicked to him, filled with pity, as if Caleb were the one lost. "Pain and holiness are the same thing," he murmured. "We just name them differently." That night, Maren woke screaming. Caleb rushed into her room. She was sitting up in bed, clutching her chest, her breath ragged. "It's inside me," she gasped. "It's burning." He tried to soothe her, but her skin was cold, her pulse racing. Her eyes darted toward the corner of the room. "She's here," she whispered. "Mother's here. She says the pain was never meant for me." And then her voice broke into a laugh, soft, breathless, trembling. When she looked back at Caleb, the firelight caught in her eyes, and he realized what terrified him most. Maren wasn't afraid of the pain. She was beginning to love it. By morning, the house felt heavier than it ever had, as though the air itself carried a warning. Caleb hadn't slept. He sat by the kitchen door, waiting for daylight to burn away the shadows that had moved through the halls all night. But the light that came wasn't warmth. It was grey and cold, and it brought no peace. Maren didn't come down for breakfast. When Caleb went to check on her, her bed was empty, the window open. He found her in the study instead, seated at her father's desk, her hair uncombed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On the desk before her lay Gideon's journal, open to a page dense with ink, jagged lines of scripture mixed with notes, every word written like a confession he'd never dared to speak aloud. To save her, I had to unmake her. To teach her pain, I had to become it. Forgive me, Margaret. I've done what only God should do. Caleb stared at the words, the edges of the page smudged with fingerprints, not the doctor's, but Maren's. I didn't mean to read it, she said quietly, but I think he wanted me to. Her voice was calm, steady, but her face looked older somehow, worn down by understanding. He thinks love is something you prove by suffering. Maybe that's why he could never love anything he didn't hurt. Caleb sank into the chair across from her. You shouldn't be alone with him anymore. She smiled faintly. You think I'm afraid of him? I think you should be. She tilted her head. I used to be afraid of not feeling. Now I know what it's like. It's strange. Once you've touched pain, everything else feels thin, like the world isn't real until it hurts. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the hall. Gideon entered, pale and dishevelled, the smell of spirits clinging to him. His gaze fell on the open journal. For a moment, his composure cracked. You've read it, he said, almost a whisper. Yes, Maren said, and I forgive you. He flinched. Forgive? His voice trembled, half disbelief, half horror. You don't understand. I wasn't confessing to you. I was confessing to God. Then why did you leave it open on the desk? She asked softly. Gideon's eyes shone with something feverish. Because he never answers me anymore. Maybe I thought you would. Caleb stood. She's not your priest, sir. She's your daughter. Gideon turned to him slowly. And you... His tone darkened. You're the tempter, the one who's made her believe the body is enough. That feeling without meaning is salvation. Caleb took a step forward. If salvation means she gets to live, then yes, I am. Gideon's hand shook as he pointed toward the door. Leave this house, Caleb. Before I do something neither of us can repent. But Maren's voice cut through the air like glass. If he leaves, I leave too. The silence that followed was the kind that only ends in ruin. That night, the air inside the Cross house was thick enough to taste, heavy with lamp oil, dust, and something sweeter underneath, like decay trying to pretend it was perfume. The wind outside moaned through the shutters, pressing against the house as if trying to get in. Inside, Gideon had locked himself in the study again. Maren sat by the parlour fire, her face caught between light and shadow, her bandaged hands resting still in her lap. Caleb stood near the doorway, afraid to speak. The silence between them had grown so large that words felt too small to cross it. "He's not going to stop, is he?" she asked softly, without looking up. Caleb shook his head. "No. He believes he's saving you." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then maybe he needs to see what being saved looks like. The way she said it made Caleb's chest tighten. There was no defiance in her tone, only inevitability, like a prayer she'd already decided how to answer. A sudden crash echoed upstairs, the sound of glass breaking, followed by the metallic scrape of furniture dragging. Caleb ran toward the stairs, but Maren's voice stopped him. "Let him be," she said. "He's setting the altar." When Caleb reached the study door, the smell of burning chemicals leaked through the cracks. Gideon's voice came with it, feverish and trembling. "Pain redeems the soul. Pain redeems the soul. If she won't feel, then I'll feel for her." Caleb burst through the door. Gideon stood over his desk, a bottle of ether smashed at his feet, his hands shaking as he poured lamp oil across the floor. His face glowed in the flickering lamplight, pale, wet, and wild. "Doctor, stop!" Caleb shouted. Gideon turned, smiling through tears. "Don't you see? I've been blind. The body is the vessel, the soul is the flame. Margaret burned with fever, and through her suffering she ascended. Maren will too." He struck a match. Caleb lunged, knocking it from his hand, but it was too late. The oil caught, a thin blue line of fire crawling across the floor like something alive. Maren appeared in the doorway, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Father," she whispered, her voice soft and steady, "if pain is holy, then you've already become a saint." He stared at her, trembling. "You don't understand." "I do," she said. "I understand too well." The flames licked higher, climbing the drapes. Smoke filled the room. Gideon stumbled back, coughing, muttering her name over and over. Caleb grabbed Maren's arm, pulling her toward the hall. She didn't resist, but she didn't hurry either. She looked back at her father as the fire began to devour the walls. He fell to his knees, reaching out to her through the heat. "Maren! Wait! Stay with me!" But the flames reached him first, and when his voice finally stopped, the only sound left was the crackling of wood and the slow, steady breathing of a house learning to die. The fire spread fast, leaping from room to room as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Curtains ignited in bursts, wallpaper curled black against the walls, and every portrait of the Cross family began to melt into smoke. Caleb pulled Maren down the hallway, coughing through the thickening haze. "We have to go," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the flames. Maren didn't fight him, but she didn't run either. Her eyes were fixed on the staircase behind them, on the study door now engulfed in fire. "He's still in there," she whispered. "He's gone," Caleb said. "We can't save him." "He saved me," she murmured, almost to herself, "or tried to." Caleb turned her toward him, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Maren, please. If you stay, you'll die." She looked at him then, her expression calm, distant. "I think I already did." A beam cracked overhead, sending sparks cascading down like fiery snow. Caleb threw his arm over her, pulling her close. "Not like this." You're not dying here." He half carried her toward the stairs, their feet slipping on ash and embers. The grand hall below was a furnace, furniture burning, chandeliers crashing to the ground in explosions of glass. Through the smoke, a memory flickered. Margaret's piano. It still stood near the parlour wall, the keys melting into black tears. Maren stopped when she saw it. "Mother's song," she said softly. "I can hear it." "Don't," Caleb said, pulling her forward. But she broke free, stumbling toward the piano, her white gown glowing orange in the firelight. She pressed one trembling hand to the lid. It was burning hot, but this time she flinched. Her eyes widened. "I feel it," she whispered. "Caleb, I feel it." He grabbed her, dragging her away as the ceiling groaned above them. The air was a blur of flame and smoke and memory. Gideon's voice, her laughter, Margaret's hymn carried on the crackling heat. They burst through the front door into the night. Cold air hit them like water. Behind them, the house roared, a cathedral of fire, every window spilling light onto the dark Virginia field. Maren collapsed on the grass, her body shaking with coughs that sounded like sobs. Caleb knelt beside her, pressing his hand to her back. Her skin was warm, truly warm for the first time he could remember. She turned her head toward the burning house. The reflection of the flames danced in her eyes. "Do you think he's with her now?" she asked quietly. Caleb swallowed. "I think he's finally stopped feeling." The fire's light flickered across her face. For the first time she looked neither fragile nor afraid, only alive, painfully, beautifully alive. The house on Black Hollow Road burned until morning, and when it was gone, only the magnolia tree stood, blackened but still blooming. By dawn, the house on Black Hollow Road was nothing but a skeleton, charred beams and whispering smoke rising into the grey Virginia sky. The fire had burned straight through the night, its glow seen from the town miles away. But now only ash remained. Caleb led Maren down the old path to the river, the same one they'd walked weeks before when everything had still been holding itself together. The fog had lifted, but the air was cold enough to sting. He'd wrapped his coat around her shoulders, though she didn't seem to feel the chill. They reached the bank in silence. The water moved slow and black, carrying bits of soot and ember from the fire. Maren stared at the reflection of the drifting smoke, her eyes vacant, her face pale except for the faint red burns along her wrists. "I dreamed of this place," she said quietly, "before the fire." My mother was standing there. She pointed to the opposite bank. "She told me I would understand when the world burned." Caleb knelt beside her. "Understand what?" "That feeling," she whispered, "the one he wanted to give me. It's not pain or love or mercy. It's all of them mixed together until you can't tell one from the other." He shook his head. "What he did to you wasn't love, Maren." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But it made me real." Her reflection trembled on the water's surface. She knelt, trailing her fingers in the current. The cold bit her skin, and for the first time she flinched. The movement startled her, not from pain, but from recognition. "It hurts," she said softly. "I didn't think it would." Caleb's throat tightened. "That's what living feels like." She turned to him, eyes shining in the dull light. "Then I'm alive now. But it feels wrong to be." A gust of wind swept across the river, scattering petals from the magnolia trees upstream. They floated toward her, pale, ghostly, drifting across the water like ash made beautiful. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can leave, Maren. There's nothing left here for either of us." She didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the river. He used to say the body and the soul are mirrors. Maybe that's why he broke mine, to see what was looking back. Caleb looked down at her reflection, split in two by the current. For a moment it almost seemed as though two Marens knelt at the river's edge, one calm, one trembling. She whispered, "I don't know which one I am anymore." He tightened his hand gently. "Both. That's what makes you human." She smiled again, tired, distant, but real. "Then maybe that's enough." As the wind carried the last of the ashes into the water, the reflection of the burning house faded completely. All that was left was the river, the petals, and a girl who had finally learned to feel. 2 weeks after the fire, the people of Black Hollow finally came. They arrived in wagons and on horseback, drawn by curiosity and fear in equal measure. The ashes were still damp, the air still carrying that faint metallic tang that only fire and grief can leave behind. They found what remained of the cross house, its bones jutting from the earth like the ribs of something long dead. The grand staircase had collapsed into a mound of charcoal, and the roof had fallen in on itself. Only one thing had survived almost untouched, the magnolia tree by the front gate. Blackened at the trunk, but blooming white as snow at its highest branches. The townspeople whispered that the tree was cursed. Others said it was holy. No one dared touch it. Sheriff Amos Clay stood among them, hat in hand, looking toward the river. "No bodies," he said quietly, "just ash." Either they burned clean or they walked away from the shadows near the tree line. A farmer spoke. "I seen smoke by the water a few nights ago. Thought it was the house again, but when I went down there in the morning there was only a candle floating. Lit itself, it seemed." The sheriff said nothing. He'd seen the same thing once, just before dawn. A candle drifting along the current, its flame steady despite the wind. They combed the ruins for days, finding bits of scorched metal, shards of glass, and bones too small to be certain of. The town preacher said prayers over them anyway. That Sunday, the congregation filled the small white church, and for the first time in months, Gideon Cross's name was spoken aloud. "A man undone by his own search for God," the preacher said. "Let us pray for his soul and for his child's, wherever she may be." Outside, as the crowd dispersed, a little boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, "I saw a lady by the river." She was pale and smiling, said she was waiting for someone. His mother shushed him, pulling him close. But when she looked toward the river herself, she saw it too, a figure in white, standing ankle-deep in the water, watching the smoke curl from the remains of the cross house. The woman's face was soft, unreadable, and though she stood far away, the mother swore she could see a faint smile on her lips. When the sheriff looked back moments later, the figure was gone. Only the magnolia petals floated where she'd stood, turning slowly in the current. By nightfall, the townsfolk left the ruins alone, but they all agreed on one thing: no one would build there again. And on quiet nights, when the fog rolled in from the river, they said you could still hear the faint sound of a piano playing from beneath the ashes, soft, broken notes that never resolved into a song. As summer turned to autumn, the ruins of the Cross estate became a place people avoided. The grass grew high where the foundation had been, swallowing the stones, and vines crept through the cracks like fingers reclaiming what man had stolen. The townsfolk whispered that the ground still breathed heat when the nights grew damp, that if you pressed your ear to the earth, you could hear faint humming, the echo of a song half remembered. Children dared each other to walk down Black Hollow Road after sundown, but few ever did. Those who went swore they saw lights by the river, one, sometimes two, flickering in the mist. They said a candle would drift out from the reeds and move along the current as if guided by a steady hand. Some nights it floated alone. Other nights it was joined by a reflection that wasn't quite its own. The stories spread, and with them came a name. People began calling it the Candle of Black Hollow. They said it was Maren Lee's spirit, still waiting by the water for the father who mistook salvation for cruelty. Others said she never died at all, that she lived quietly in the hills, lighting a candle each night to keep the fire that made her alive from burning out completely. Sheriff Amos Clay returned once, months after the fire, to see the place for himself. The river was calm, the magnolia tree in bloom again. The air smelled of earth and flowers, not smoke. But when he bent to the water's edge, he saw it, a candle flame floating on the surface, its reflection perfectly still. And beside it, for just a moment, two faint figures, a girl in white and a man standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder. He blinked, and they were gone. He told no one what he'd seen, but from that day forward he left a candle burning in his window each night, for the girl who'd wanted to feel and the man who'd wanted her to suffer to prove she could. Years passed. The story twisted and aged like all ghost tales do. Some said Maren's candle only appeared when someone nearby was dying, a light to guide them toward peace. Others said it was a warning that pain, once invited, never truly leaves. But those who lived closest to the river claimed something different. They said on certain misty mornings, when the world was quiet enough, you could see her sitting on the bank, not as a ghost, but as a woman. Her hands folded, her eyes distant, the same faint smile on her lips as she watched the candle drift away. And if you listened closely, you might hear her whisper, "I can feel it now." Then the river would swallow the sound, carrying it downstream, where no one could ever prove it was real. The years washed over Black Hollow like silt in a slow river, burying what had happened but never erasing it. The road grew over with vines, the magnolia tree thickened and bent with age, and soon only the oldest townsfolk remembered the Cross family at all. But memory, like pain, doesn't vanish. It only changes shape. On quiet evenings, when the fog rolled in from the lowlands and the moon touched the river like a coin on dark glass, people said you could still see a light moving along the water, a candle's flame, steady and small. They said it never drifted far from the bank where Maren once stood, and that if you looked closely, there were always two reflections. One bright, one faint. Some thought it was a trick of the current. Others swore it was something holier, a daughter and her father, bound forever by the one thing neither could name without breaking. Caleb never returned to the town. He wandered south, then west, working the fields until his hair turned white. But every night he carried a single candle in his pack. When he lit it, he whispered her name, not in grief, but in reverence, as though she had become something larger than sorrow. He once said to a farmer's child who asked about his scars, "Some pains don't come from wounds. They come from love that stayed too long." In the years that followed, the story of Maren Lee Cross became a quiet legend, not of ghosts or curses, but of a girl who had to burn to feel what the rest of the world took for granted. Some told it as a warning, others as a prayer. And sometimes, on warm nights, when the wind carried the scent of magnolia down the valley, travelers swore they could hear faint music drifting from the ruins, the sound of a piano, just one note at a time, played by hands that no longer trembled. In the end, the house on Black Hollow Road returned to the earth that birthed it. The magnolia tree stood watch, its white petals falling like snow into the river. Beneath the water, the reflection of two candles glowed side by side, one bright as life, one dim as memory, and together they moved slowly downstream, carried by a current that asked nothing of them, because in the end, pain had done what love never could. It had made her real. Before you go, subscribe to the Macabre Record for more forgotten stories, where the line between mercy and madness, love and cruelty, blurs like candlelight on water. And tell me in the comments, do you think Maren found peace, or did she finally learn to live through pain?